Welcome, you're watching To The Point. As Prime Minister Modi and his government get down to work, we focus on both the controversies that have cropped up as well as the priorities the government has set for itself. In part 2, we shall discuss the Prime Minister's 10-point agenda. Is it a set of meaningful directions or just well-intentioned cliches? But first, the controversy over the government's ordinance to amend the TRAI Act and facilitate Nripendra Mishra's appointment as the Prime Minister's Principal Secretary. Was this a well-considered move by the government, or inadvisable and likely to set a worrying precedent? And now joining me to discuss the government's ordinance is BJP spokesperson and lawyer Pinky Anand, the former Minister for Information and Broadcasting and a leading lawyer himself Manish Tiwari, and two of the Supreme Court's most distinguished senior lawyers, Dushyant Dave and former Deputy Chairman of the Law Commission, KTS Tulsi. But my first guest, in fact, is the BJP's leader and lawyer, Aman Sinha. Mr. Sinha, let me start with a simple question. Given that an ordinance is only permissible to take immediate action, and second, given that Parliament will be meeting in exactly 1 week's time, how does your government justify promulgating an ordinance to amend the TRAI Act?
Current TRAI Act had a lacuna, and it imposed unreasonable restriction on, officers and the chairman of TRAI, and therefore the government, thought in its wisdom to do away with that lacuna, and I think it's a welcome development. I don't see any difficulty with that. If you see other regulatory
Can I interrupt you? The Constitution is... Can I interrupt you? The Constitution is specific, Mr. Sinha. It makes it absolutely crystal clear that it is only permissible to promulgate an ordinance to take immediate action. What is the urgency in this case?
No, but Karan, if you agree that there was a lacuna, there was a shortcoming in the statute, there was an unreasonable restriction, if it has been done away with, what is the difficulty?
Except that lacuna, as you so call it, has been there since 1997. And the Act was in fact amended in 2000, but the lacuna wasn't corrected at that point. So you're now amending in haste something that's existed for 17 years and more.
Absolutely right. So all the more reason that when there was an unreasonable provision which was there on the statute book, it should be done away with at the earliest possible, and ordinance has to be exercised in cases of administrative exigency, and this was a case for exercising it. If you see other regulatory bodies...
I've heard you, Mr. Sinha, and I accept your answer, but I have to point out for the sake of the ordinance for the audience that it's very strange that you believe it's urgent to do something that you could have done at any point in the last 17 years. But let me pursue that same point with you, Manish Tiwari, and let me pursue it like this. A new Prime Minister clearly needs a Principal Secretary, and any delay would hamper the smooth functioning of the PMO. Why is that not an acceptable argument to say this is an urgent matter?
First of all, Karan, I do not think there is any quibble with the gentleman in question or his credentials or even the prerogative of the Prime Minister to have whomsoever he wishes as his Principal Secretary. So I think that's a non sequitur, and there's no quibble with that at all. The quibble really is with the process. Now, there was a clear bar in the TRAI Act, and as you yourself were pointing out, it had held the field for 17 long years. And at the cusp of this government taking office, the first act which they initiate is to promulgate an ordinance in order to facilitate an appointment. Now, this is the same Bharatiya Janata Party which had opposed the promulgation of ordinances on questions as vital as the Food Security Act or the Land Acquisition Act. So therefore, allow me to complete.
I'll broaden it and talk about the hypocrisy in a moment. What about my point that a PM
Allow
needs...
me to complete.
No, can I just finish? I will broaden the discussion to the BJP's hypocrisy in a moment's time. But at the moment, my question is a very specific one. A PM needs a Principal Secretary. Any delay will hamper the functioning of the PMO. Is that not a good argument for saying this is an urgent matter? Answer that for me.
Well, I'll answer it straight off the bat, Karan. I think one-man legislations and ordinances also a legislation is not desirable, whether to facilitate an appointment or to discriminate against somebody. So therefore, if you have law which is specifically aimed at one person, I do not know as to how proper it is, how desirable it is, and how does it, really fit into the four corners of propriety.
Okay.
So that's the answer to your question.
Dushyant Dave, on the other hand, Mr. Mishra could have started as an advisor and there would be no bar whatsoever, and he could have functioned just as effectively. And then he could have been made Principal Secretary after Parliament had passed a bill amending the TRAI Act. That would have had no impact on the smooth functioning of the PMO, but it would have ensured that constitutional proprieties were observed, which is important. Surely that was the route Mr. Modi should have taken, rather than try and breach constitutional proprieties to make Mr. Mishra the Principal Secretary in this seemingly improper way.
First and foremost, Karan, I do not agree that there is any constitutional impropriety here. In fact, the Constitution expressly authorizes President, his satisfaction of the immediate action is not subject to debate. It's not even subject to being questioned before a court of law. He is guided by the Council of Ministers. Now, if the Prime Minister and his Council felt that there is a need immediately to have a principal advisor,
Mr. Dave,
look, forget
you're
it.
selectively reading the Constitution. Mr. Dave, you're selectively reading the Constitution. I have Article 123 in front of me, and it says perfectly clearly that this is only permissible when it is necessary for him to take immediate action. That's why the whole thing hinges on urgency, not on the President having the right to do it.
Correct.
What's the urgency?
I agree, but the... No, just a minute. Yes, the expression immediate action is not defined in the article. It has to be interpreted on these given circumstances of the case. And if these circumstances justify, in the opinion of the Council of Ministers and the President, that's the end of the story. I don't think it's something which really needs to be debated. And mind you, there is no constitutional impropriety because Parliament is admittedly not in session. This is not a mala fide action which has been taken. It's a purely bona fide administrative action taken to run the government as quickly as possible. Supposing tomorrow there is a nuclear issue which arises, supposing a war comes up, all kinds of issues come up before a nation as large as we are. I mean, we are a $2 trillion economy. We need to move quickly.
I take your point.
I don't think the article really controls this in any manner.
Okay, let me put it like this, Mr. Tulsi. We're still talking about the propriety, and I think that's an important concern. Will civil servants respect a Principal Secretary who they believe has come to office as a result of an improper appointment procedure? Will they respect a Principal Secretary who they feel is tainted by this ordinance route that is questionable even if it's not controversial? Does that not put Mr. Mishra in a very invidious position for no fault of his own?
That's true. I believe that the appointment of a Principal Secretary does not hinge the governance. In fact, this amendment by an ordinance is an excellent proof of bad governance. The statute, the bar in the statute is based on constitutional principle of independence of judiciary, and the prohibition against employment is contained on that basis even with regard to quasi-judicial tribunals. The bar was with regard to employment in the industry as well as the government, and the bar of employment in the government was absolute. That was for a good reason. That is to assure the independent functioning, which is a basic structure of the Constitution. And here, they say that if there is a nuclear threat and there is a war, it doesn't hinge on the appointment of a particular individual as a Principal Secretary. There are a pool of people. This government itself has advised all the ministers to accept their personal staff out of the pool, and not to appoint people of their own choice. This is an ideal example.
It's an ideal example of bad governance. I'll finish your sentence for you. Pinky Anand,
bad governance.
I want to take up a point made by Manish Tiwari a moment before you joined us. He pointed out very correctly that a second problem with this ordinance, beyond the propriety that we've been discussing, is that it focuses entirely on one individual, and therefore it breaches the well-established convention that laws are never passed to assist or to debar a single individual. How do you account for that single individual focus and the breaching of that convention?
I think, Karan, the entire principles that anybody is talking about do not really seem to come into the picture. What is the question today before us? The question is, a particular officer is required by the Prime Minister,
just
and particularly a Prime Minister who's headed... Just a minute, Karan.
Forgive me,
the Prime Minister who's headed the 10-point agenda, which has come
but
forth
because you were late joining the show,
right.
Please don't take the discussion back to what we've already covered. You were late joining our show, but we can't go back and rewind it. Please answer my question. And the question is a point made by Manish Tiwari, a lawyer like you. He pointed out that legislation is never passed to assist or debar a single individual. How do you account for the fact that in this instance, you've broken that convention?
No, Karan, there is no convention of the kind that you cannot have any situation which will cover an individual. First of all, this could be extended across to others. There is no bar to that. Creating an ordinance, putting an ordinance, promulgating an ordinance is within the wisdom of the government, which it has done. The only question that seems to be raised is why not when the parliament is in session? If it had been so, then there would have been no question. You're talking about governance in the country.
I'll tell you why I asked my question.
A particular person who...
I'll tell you why I asked that question. You see, the law that sets up the Central Vigilance Commission has a similar condition debarring further government employment. If you were really amending such conditions in all laws, you would have amended that as well, but you haven't. That survives. Yet in the TRAI Act, you amended it because you want to benefit Mr. Mishra.
Benefit, no. The person is entitled. You are wanting a particular officer who is shown his competence, whose competence is not an issue. There is no malafide exercise. There is desire of creating good governance along with a particular officer, and the need is urgent for sure. When you're running a country such as India, you require the principal secretary in place. Therefore, the ordinance route when the parliament is not in session.
All right.
What more do you have to say in this issue?
Well, I tell you, Manish Tiwari will probably have a lot more, and I'm going to go straight to him to give him a chance. Manish Tiwari, like yourself, I'm not questioning Mr. Mishra's suitability. Let's make that clear. Absolutely no one is questioning his credentials. We're questioning the process by which it's happened. And now I want to draw your attention to whether this process has actually set a very unfortunate precedent, which could be used to help other less deserving individuals. Because now once you've removed the bar, successors to that job, chairman of TRAI, may well aspire to government jobs, and it may affect the way they carry out their decisions as TRAI chairman. Suddenly there's an opportunity for them to be swayed which didn't exist earlier. Does that worry you?
Well, I think, Karan, I could not agree with you more. Mr. KTS Tulsi was correctly pointing out that the bar...
Carry on, Manish Tiwari.
Well, in the sense Karan is not providing the answer, he's asking, he's putting a preposition. All that I'm trying to point out is that what Mr. KTS Tulsi was saying, that the bar under section 5, subsection 8 was absolute for in the case of government employment. And the reason was so that the regulator does not become a handmaiden of the government. Now, having removed that bar, which would apply for every successor, it is going to create a certain amount of ambiguity, a certain amount of loss of confidence in the industry, that here is a regulator who can be re-employed by the government. So therefore, his efficiency, his impartiality, his objectivity are things which are going to come into question. And that still does not answer the basic point I've raised. The desirability of one-man legislation.
Well, I don't know if we're going to get an answer. Pinky Anand gave you what she thought was an answer. Sushant Dave, I want to...
the same proposition to say it could affect other people. So therefore, to say it is one-man legislation, you're countering your own argument. I don't understand where your one-man argument is going in any event. It doesn't go any further. On one hand, you say it will be discriminatory because it will affect other people who come to the same position and therefore
let me stop you. Your answer is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the question. The first issue that Manish Tiwari raised was that in law, there is a well-established convention that legislation does not get made to benefit a single individual or debar a single individual. It's in that sense this is a one-man issue. But having set the precedent, you now are open to its misuse.
Principle is Karan, only 1 minute, maybe 30 seconds you can give me to say this, that Manish Tiwari's own argument is that other people who will be TRAI chairmen can be appointed, so therefore it is not one-man legislation in the first place.
No, we're talking about the misuse of the precedent that you've set. Let's not quarrel over what is essentially, and I insist on saying it, a misunderstanding on your part. I want to bring in Dushyant Dave, who's patiently listening.
Which would be in the industry.
Dushyant Dave,
you have a person who can possibly be reappointed by government, so therefore his objectivity and impartiality will come into question. The others.
All right. I'm going to stop the two of you carrying on a personal quarrel with each other. The elections are over. This is now a civilized discussion. We need to keep it civilized. Dushyant Dave, I want to put that central concern to you. We're no longer talking about the propriety of the matter. You disagreed with my question on that. I'm now drawing your attention to whether, in creating this legislation and removing the bar on employment with the government for the TRAI chairman, are we setting a precedent that's worrying? I want to quote to you EAS Sharma, a former finance secretary and power secretary, in today's Business Standard. He says, the independence of regulatory authorities is pivotal to any economic reform strategy. It is highly undesirable for any government to dilute this statutory provision. It will be sending a negative and undesirable signal. He's echoing the fears you heard a moment ago from Manish Tiwari. Where do you stand on that issue? Has this set a bad precedent and opened the doors for misuse?
Karan, I don't think it is a bad precedent at all, because you take, for example, Supreme Court judges and High Court judges. There is no bar on them accepting any government position after the retirement, and they discharge far more important functions than a TRAI chairman does. One. Two, this amendment is not, really to benefit just Mr. Mishra today. It will benefit everybody in future tomorrow who occupies that position of chairman of or member of the TRAI. So therefore, it's not an individual specific. And three, most important, ordinances are generally fact specific. They are not principle specific. Therefore, I do not agree that there is any kind of a constitutional immorality in having this kind of an ordinance.
It's very interesting that you began by referring to High Court judges and Supreme Court judges. Have you forgotten what Arun Jaitley, now the finance minister, but he was speaking as leader of the opposition, used to say that in fact there should be a bar on judges getting appointments after retirement because it leads to question marks being asked about their judicial pronouncements when they were judges on the bench. He himself has said that in fact there should be a clear bar. That convention has often been breached. He thinks there should be a bar. And this is the same argument in the case of the TRAI chairman. As Mr. Tulsi was saying, it's a semi-judicial position he occupies. People wonder whether, therefore, in retrospect, if he gets a government job, was his decisions tailored to trying to get one? That's the suspicion. That's why it's a bad precedent. Do you not want to agree with that?
No, I don't think there is any convention qua judges at all. And therefore, the question doesn't arise. They may bring a law tomorrow. But I personally feel that this was a ridiculous provision. And it should never have come in the first instance because there is no, rationale behind it.
In which case?
After all, appointing a person from a tribunal to a government position is not something. If he can go to a private sector upon retirement, what is wrong about accepting a government job?
All right. I take your point. All I'll point out, as I was saying a moment ago to Pinky Anand, that if it was really a ridiculous provision, then surely the same provision in the Central Vigilance Commission law should also be removed, because the Central Vigilance Commissioner can't find another job with the government, and it's the same set of concerns on either side. But let me bring you in, KTS Tulsi, and let me put it like this. You firmly believe that there was no case for urgency. You firmly believe that this ordinance breaches constitutional propriety. You firmly agree that it is a measure that has been undertaken to help one individual. And those are three reasons why surely President Mukherjee should have either asked the government to rethink or at least advised caution. Do you think that he should have thought very carefully before he signed on the dotted line? He seems to have done that signing on the dotted line very quickly and without any second thoughts himself.
I don't know, but I really feel that this was a reckless provision brought about through an ordinance. It is so reckless, it is completely irrational. It defeats the purpose of establishing the tribunal. The purpose of establishing the tribunal is to guarantee its independence.
But
if you are going to remove the bar...
Can I stop you?
So I really
Can I stop you for a moment? All of these are concerns that Mr. Mukherjee, the president, would have been aware of. He'd also been aware of the fact that there's no crashing urgency. He would have been aware of the fact that this ordinance is individual specific. He'd have been aware of the fact that it could potentially set bad precedents and lead to misuse in future years. Should he not therefore have advised caution?
I really think he ought to have and pointed out that this smacks of favoritism and nepotism. It's only a question of appointing a principal secretary. There are dozens of people who may be as capable or even more.
All right.
And therefore, you can't change law to favor someone.
Absolutely. Therefore, as you say, and I'm underlining it for the audience, the president should have advised caution. We don't know whether he did or not, of course, because we don't know what happens in private in communication between the president and the prime minister. Pinky Anand, I want to bring up a second point made by Manish Tiwari. You know, the BJP strongly objected when the government passed the food security law by ordinance. You were dead against anti-corruption legislation being promulgated by ordinance when Rahul Gandhi wanted to do that. Is it not now hypocritical for you to use the ordinance route to facilitate Nripendra Mishra becoming principal secretary?
Karan, I think you might want to distinguish a little bit here. What happened as far as the food security bill was concerned or the anti-corruption ordinance was concerned was they were only politically timed and their malefides were obvious. The only attempt was to gain political mileage by bringing him in through the ordinance route because they could not bring it through ordinary legislation. Karan, allow me to complete. In this case, it was purely as it's in front of everybody and it probably acknowledged that it is an administrative exigency which is being exercised. No malefides are being alleged. The gentleman's credibility is hardly an issue by anybody. Not hardly, I am just making a statement, meaning not an issue. So therefore, there is no comparison of the two issues. Yes, preferably law should be made by when the parliament is sitting, but when it is not, you require the urgency. When the new prime minister has come into office, you do require to run the government of the country. You start with major agendas from the first 3 days. If you have that prime ministerial office in place by virtue of an ordinance for an administrative exigency, I don't think there's any issue whatsoever.
Manish Tiwari, you know, you were complaining about the hypocrisy, as you called it, of the BJP government. The truth is that you are equally guilty when you were in government of misusing ordinances, and the food security ordinance is a classic example. There was absolutely no urgency when you passed it, and you passed it just weeks before Parliament was anyway going to commence. So with what face can you today criticize the government when they're actually following the example you set?
Karan, I find it extremely amusing, the comparison which my friend Pinky Anand is trying to make. The food security bill, you know, which finally became law, was something which was supposed to or is touching the lives of 80 crore people.
There was no urgency.
It was not an individual specific ordinance.
So why
or the other ordinances which you talk about. So therefore, Pinky, why are you interrupting? Why don't you have the patience to listen?
The point you're ignoring, Mr. Tiwari, is you set the bad precedent, the government followed it, now you can't accuse them of hypocrisy.
Karan, I find this amusing that something which is going to benefit 80 crore people is malafide and something which is going to benefit one particular individual is bona fide.
Urgency in both cases. The misuse of the ordinance is what I'm questioning.
That a one-man legislation is bona fide, you know, it is justified on the grounds of administrative expediency, but something which is going to benefit 80 crore people, you know, is termed as politically malified.
I think we're back to two-party spokesmen quarreling. It's clearly politics as usual. This is what we're used to. This is the fun of political discussions. But I'll just point out for the sake of the ordinance, I wasn't questioning in either the case of the Nripendra Mishra's ordinance, if I can so call it, or the food security ordinance, the actual content. I was questioning the propriety of whether it is an urgent matter or not and the manner in which it was done, and those are different issues. But my thanks to all four of my guests for joining me. Prime Minister Modi's decision to announce his top 10 priorities was a novel and welcome move. But what has been revealed may be much more questionable. At first sight, it seems like a cliched set of intentions. But is that a misleading impression, or is that actually the truth? My guests are the Assistant Editor of the Business Standard, Mihir Sharma, the well-known senior journalist and columnist, Aarti Jarat, BJP spokesperson Sanjay Kaul and former Defence Secretary and Civil Aviation Secretary Ajay Prasad. Sanjay Kaul, at first sight, Mr. Modi's top 10 priorities seem a bit like well-intentioned cliches that no person could actually conceivably disagree with. So let me ask you, what's so special or remarkable about these top 10 priorities?
Yeah, well, Karan, frankly, the thing about governance by and large is that it follows the same rules everywhere. So it is really not rocket science most often. And what is different is, of course, that when you have a regime which has not been able to deliver on many of the fronts that you would see as nominal or normal, then you could possibly ask, or you could possibly look at this askance. But I think the fact of the matter is that you have to do typical things. The important point is intention, and the important point is delivery. And I think in that sense, governance, since it follows the same rules everywhere else, I think it'd be strange to expect something else to come out of it. The important point, like I said, is basically delivery, the ability to deliver, the confidence to deliver.
Ajay Prasad, the one difference with Dr. Manmohan Singh's government is that at no point did the former Prime Minister announce what his top 10, leave aside his top 5 priorities were. At least Mr. Modi has given the country 10 benchmarks by which to judge his government. Don't you think that deserves a certain amount of credit?
I absolutely agree that this is the first time the government, within the first 72 hours of its inception, has come out with a roadmap. Now, you can criticize it by saying that the details are not there, there are lots of dots to be connected, but at least it sets the priorities for the line ministries. And now it will be individual ministries responsible for these various activities to draw up clear blueprints on how to take this forward. I think this is a very important step that the government has taken.
All right, let's come, Mihir Sharma, to these top 10 priorities one by one and actually examine to what extent they are a roadmap and to what extent they are just cliches or at best a statement of intent. Now, the first is build up confidence in bureaucracy so they do not fear to face consequences. But the critical question is, how do you build up confidence in the bureaucracy? And the only hint Mr. Modi gives is that his government will welcome innovative ideas and babus will be given freedom to work. In your eyes, is that sufficient to build up confidence, or would you like to hear more details before you believe the credibility of point number 1?
In central Delhi, pretty much every bureaucrat is terrified of corruption investigations above all. They're concerned that if they take a decision that is seen as benefiting one party or another, particularly in something related to, say, an infrastructure contract, 4 or 5 years down the line, maybe after they've retired, the CBI, the Lokpal, somebody like that will come knocking on their door in the middle of the night. And this is a perfectly valid fear.
But is it adequately addressed by that simple point? It's not.
It is not.
So you would have liked more details before this assurance becomes credible?
I'm sure the Prime Minister will eventually reveal this detail, but as of now, there's nothing here.
As of now, there's nothing here. Yeah. Let me put something else to you, Mr. Ajay Prasad. One paradox is that although Mr. Modi, in his point number 1, which is his top priority, wants to build confidence in the bureaucracy, in point 2, he calls them babus. Now, usually that's a derisory and a demeaning way of referring to civil servants. Are you pleased to be part of a tribe that the Prime Minister calls babus?
No, I don't think I would take any umbrage at the use of the expression babu. I think it's become a common parlance now. But the fact is that he has highlighted the importance of the implementing machinery. You see, so far, and especially in the UPA 2, we saw that on one hand there was policy paralysis, on the second hand the implementation of whatever decisions could be taken were not being effectively implemented, and there were benefits were not reaching the intended target population. Now here what he is trying to do is that he is trying to address this to the bureaucracy, which is the implementing arm for the government, to say, go ahead and implement fearlessly.
All right.
And, consequently, this confidence is something which cannot be built overnight.
I have
but by action of individual ministers and by Prime Minister's own support, I think this will gradually build up, and the senior officers would emboldened to take decisions.
Aarti Jared, you're joining us now. Unfortunately, the video link is not working, so we have you on the phone. We're talking about points 1 and 2 of Mr. Modi's top priorities, which are to build confidence in the bureaucracy. Mihir Sharma told me a moment ago that he would like to have seen more detail before this assurance of confidence in the bureaucracy becomes credible. On the other hand, you've heard Mr. Ajay Prasad, the former bureaucrat, saying that the simple promise to give bureaucrats freedom to work will be a great assurance for them. Let me bring you in as an independent political analyst and ask me, which of these two do you agree with? The need for more detail before it becomes credible, as Mihir Sharma put it, or the fact that an assurance of freedom of work is sufficient, as Mr. Ajay Prasad put it? Who do you agree with?
Well, I would tend to go with Mihir Sharma because I think that, many governments in the past have given all kinds of assurances, but we haven't really seen it translate into action. So when you say empower the bureaucracy, create confidence in the bureaucracy.
Okay. Aarti, I'm going to stop you there. The audio is so poor, we can't really make out what you're saying. We'll have to get that line back. I don't think it's a purposeful line at the moment. Sanjay Kaul, let's move on to the economy, which everyone seems to agree is perhaps the biggest challenge the government faces. Now, all that point 7 says, and I want to quote, is it will address concerns relating to the economy. Full stop, end of point 7. But that's so obvious, it's meaningless. This point doesn't even identify what the main concerns are.
I think, Karan, this is probably being taken in a completely different context. And also with regard to the earlier point, I did want to interject at that point, that you have to see the context in which, for instance, this aspect about bureaucracy and and allowing these people to work fearlessly, it's coming from. I think you have to understand that they have gone through, the bureaucracy particularly has gone through, on the one level, on accusations of conniving in many cases, on the other that they have been completely paranoid of action. So I think as a confidence building measure, as an intention, as an indication of how he wants to proceed, I think you have to see it from that context.
Okay, but focus. What's the context that makes this point 7 on the economy, which is so vague as to be meaningless, actually meaningful? Tell me the context.
Yeah, exactly. I would say that the details can follow an intention, and I don't think that's not putting the cart before the horse. I think in any case, your mission statement comes out first. The details can be filled in later. So I'm not so worried about the fact that details are not
hang on a second. If this is meant to be a mission statement, what do you make of something that is virtually 5 words? And here they are: address concerns relating to economy. You expect every government to do it. Number 2, you expect the government to tell you what are the concerns, and here it doesn't. So I put it to you again. This is so obvious, so cliched, it's meaningless.
I could argue back that if you were to have these 10 points and not have this particular point, I think that you would find very, very difficult to absorb. So I think the point still remains the same.
All right, that sounds to me as if you're saying they couldn't think of something better to say on the economy, so better this meaningless one than nothing at all.
I think if you look at the content of a lot of the stuff that has been said during the elections, when Mr. Modi was addressing the nation in many cases, if you look at the manifesto, I think there's a lot of detailed work, and you do know, for instance, I know that you know that a lot of work on economic policy has already been done inside. But so I think you just have to be a little patient with that one.
All right, I think you may be overestimating how much attention the country has paid to the BJP manifesto and how willingly the country remembers what Mr. Modi said in his speeches. I think when you come up with top 10 priorities, they should be explicable in themselves without having to refer to context. But you may be right, there is a context that is necessary that I perhaps can't see. Mihir Sharma, let's come to point number 8. It talks of infrastructural and investment reforms. But again, there's no detail given. For instance, would you, as an economist, have liked some sort of time frame for passing things like DTC and GST, for tackling tax issues like Vodafone, for insurance caps being raised, or even for labour reforms which the BJP manifesto talks about? There's no time frame, there's no commitment. All it says simply is infrastructure and investment reforms.
I think that this couldn't possibly be the 100-day policy agenda for this government. This couldn't possibly be anything other than a reflection of what Mr. Modi sees as the ways that the UPA 2 went wrong in the last 2 years. I think that is much more how we should view this. That UPA 2 ran into trouble because it did not have a clear way in which to empower its bureaucrats. UPA 2 ran into trouble because it did not change the way in which it financed infrastructure. UPA too ran into trouble because it wasn't clear enough in saying that the economy's fundamentals were sound. Mr. Modi intends to change all those things around.
Except that the point is this set of 4 words, which is point number 8, infrastructural and investment reforms, is at best just a statement of intent, full stop. It doesn't give you any detail to give you some insight into that intent. Would you accept that?
I absolutely agree.
We're back with Aarti Jarrett. Hopefully the line will work better this time. Aarti Jarrett, I want to take up point 3, which says that education, health, water, energy and roads will be a priority. Now, if I recall correctly, these areas were also a priority with UPA. But is there any assurance in these top 10 priorities that Mr. Modi will succeed where the UPA didn't? Surely that's what in fact people are looking for, proof that you will be more successful, rather than simply stating that for us something is a priority just as it was for UPA.
No, absolutely. In fact, you're talking about water. I remember we can go as far back as Rajiv Gandhi's tenure, because he started the National Water Mission, which was a promise to deliver clean drinking water to every village in India. And, clearly that mission hasn't succeeded. So, but, before we prejudge Narendra Modi, I think that we need to give him a little time. This is obviously a statement of intent. And, let's hope that he delivers, because God knows the country desperately needs delivery. It desperately needs systems. It desperately needs reform in all kinds of areas. Inflation needs to be tackled. We need sort of education reforms. We need to really get down to it.
Okay.
And it's just unfortunate that, for instance, the education minister has already run into all this controversy for the last 3 days. So, and nobody seems to be addressing that.
Well, actually, forgive me, we did address it in a very big way yesterday, but the education minister's problems are a different subject. We covered them in great detail yesterday. Let's stick for now to Mr. Modi's priorities and whether we believe they're credible or just cliched. Ajay Prashad, there is one particular priority where, in fact, the sense of being simply intent is not true. It does go beyond that, and that is point 4. It says there will be transparency in government, and much more importantly, it adds e-auction will be permitted in tendering and other government work. Do you believe that here Mr. Modi is clearly indicating to the country that the sort of problems UPA faced with Colgate, where UPA's failure to implement auctions, will not be repeated in Mr. Modi's government, and that commitment to e-auction is perhaps the first clear detail that emerges in these priorities?
I think this is a very important point that has been listed there. This hits at the very whole argument about corruption, which Mr. Modi has been repeatedly referring to in all his election speeches and also in the manifesto of the BJP. Now, when you are talking of transparency in the government and avoiding, the system of closed kind of bidding processes or on absolutely non-transparent activities of this kind, and instead of e-auctions, you are striking a major blow against corruption in these areas. And I think this is one of the critical steps that the government has listed out in these priorities.
Okay. And so this is an area where you applaud Mr. Modi for having hit the right note. A quick yes or no?
Yes, I think so. Yes, sir.
Sanjay Kaul, let's come to some of the priorities that are not to do with economic issues, not to do with social issues, but are really to do with enforcing good governance. Now, point 9 says, policy will be implemented in a time-bound manner. But once again, I put it to you, we're back to the old problem here. This is nothing more than just a statement of intent. All governments promise that things will be implemented in a time-bound manner. No government ever says that they will drag and delay. So when Mr. Modi repeats what every government has said, what's so credible about that? What's so remarkable about that?
I think I answered that in the first question that you asked, and I thought that I suggested that you do roughly the same things, but it depends on how well you do them and how well you intend to do them and whether you do them at all. So I think that remains to be seen, of course. And also, I think you're being a little harsh and judgmental on this, on the pointers, because I think you were asking a question, Mr. Prasad, whether he agreed with the idea of corruption and what we intend to do about it. I think it was completely in the same vein as the others. These are pointers, these are indicators, these are all, as much for inward consumption as they are for outwards. I think Mr. Modi has indicated that he's looking for a 100-day agenda from everybody, and he just outlined the sort of work that he wants done, and he's prioritized them.
Right.
I think if you would like to look at it like that, I don't think anybody disagree with any of the contents of that 10-pointer.
Let me interpret Sanjay Kaul and put that to you and ask you if you agree with my interpretation. What he's really saying is that all governments may commit themselves to time-bound delivery, but the proof of this pudding is in the eating, and we have to wait and see whether Mr. Modi lives up to it. At this moment, he's expressed his intent, but we have to wait and see whether he lives up to and fulfills and delivers. Is that a fair interpretation of what he's saying?
I think it's slightly more than that. It's also to say that this is, people had lost confidence in the UPA, and Narendra Modi, they have confidence in, for whatever reason, because of his history.
So his intent is enough for now?
So his intent is enough to keep things going and to keep confidence going in the economy and in the government for a little while.
Aarti Jarat, if I understood you correctly, you were a bit more skeptical. Point 10 talks about stability and sustainability in government policy. But once again, I put it to you, that's the sort of commitment all prime ministers and governments make. I've never heard of a prime minister or a minister who says that my policy won't be stable and it won't be sustained. That's something they say automatically. So once again, when Mr. Modi reiterates that obvious sentiment, is there something remarkable about it? Or do you agree with Sanjay Kaul's point that given the track record of UPA, just the reiteration is hugely reassuring?
Absolutely. I think this commitment needs to be seen in the context of the kind of inconsistencies we saw through UPA 2. And in fact, this is one big problem that all foreign investors had with UPA 2 because they felt there was too much flip-flop on policy. So if Narendra Modi is making that one of the 10 points of his mission statement, I think it's a very important signal to all foreign investors, anybody wanting to do business in India, that this government intends to keep policy stable and consistent. So I think that's very important, and this is something which is absolutely in the hands of the central government. You know, implementation of policy, you have to approach the states, and you have to get the states on board. But consistency in policy is entirely in the hands of the central government, and I think that's something that Narendra Modi can definitely deliver on.
You know, Mr. Ajay Prasad, let me reverse the direction and flow of my questions a little. Would you accept that at the end of the day, even if these 10 priorities lack detail, even if at times they seem more like intent and nothing more, they do two things. First of all, they clearly recognize existing problems, which sometimes UPA was not prepared to do, and sometimes it was actually blind to them. And secondly, in stating intent, they are also making a commitment to tackle. Now, many would say that's going halfway to solving the problem. UPA never even got as far as that. Would you accept that that's a fair way of looking at this?
Yes, Mr. Thapar, you know, if you look at these 10 points, at least 6 of them concentrate and address the issues of implementation and delivery mechanisms. So there's a preponderance of emphasis on how to deliver the decisions. Now, rest of it, you know, the details and all will follow, but the importance that has been given to the delivery mechanisms and the implementation aspect is something very well placed.
Okay.
And this is something to be commended.
Sanjay Kaul,
on the other hand, you know, the last point that you were mentioning about the stability of policy, it is a major step to restore investor confidence in the country now.
True.
Unless that is done, unless the investor has an assurance that the policies will not change frequently, you will not get investment coming in. So
absolutely.
I think for the revival of the
was
economy,
the point
that is one of the critical concerns.
That was the point Aarti Jarat was making herself a moment ago. Very quickly, Sanjay Kaul, because time is always our enemy.
Yes, I agree with what she said.
Okay. Very quickly, Sanjay Kaul, because time is always our enemy. I want to move beyond the 10 points to two things Mr. Venkaiah Naidu said the Prime Minister had mentioned specifically to his ministers at the cabinet meeting today. Number one, the Prime Minister called upon all ministers to ensure good, appropriate, meaningful delegation of work and meaningful involvement in participation of decision making to MOSs. And secondly, the Prime Minister told his ministers to be very attentive and responsive to issues raised by state governments. Do you believe that those, in a very real sense, are a reflection of his own experience in Gujarat as a state chief minister, and the realization that the manner in which Indian federalism works often diminishes the role of the state and gives more prominence than necessary to the centre? Is this a reflection of that sentiment?
Indeed, but not just that. You also have to understand that when you are in a position of power and you are running a team, you have to make sure that all team members feel engaged and involved. So whether it was a state and the various departments that you're talking about, or whether it's the center and the states that you're talking about, and within that also making sure that the MOSs are involved, I think these are indicators from somebody who's very serious about running a tight ship and making sure that it's on course. Also, I think, as if I may just refer back to what Aarti said, she's talked about foreign investment and consistency in policy. Remember, it's not just foreign investment, it's also local investment. It's also local businesses and commerce, which is thirsting for some sort of consistency. And also, please do not underestimate the power of reassurance. Okay. And remember that the last government was always faulted for not speaking enough. And so, in many ways, when you list out pointers like that, you're not only telling yourself, but also indicating what you should be judged by.
Okay. Very quickly, I want to come back to that point made by Mr. Venkaiah Naidu about the homily delivered to the ministers. We don't know to what extent individual cabinet ministers will actually delegate and meaningfully involve their MOSs. Time alone will tell. But do you get the feeling that as a former chief minister, and as someone who firmly believed that the voice of states is not heard enough, that Mr. Modi will be very responsive to the demand the states make of the centre and will ensure that his ministers pay heed to state chief ministers regardless of whether they are from the BJP or elsewhere? Do you think that's a matter of individual concern for him?
I think that he felt that under the UPA there was a great deal of talking down to smarter and more effective chief ministers by various sort of policy wonks at the centre, and he never got along, very well with the policy establishment in Delhi, and I think he wants to change that, because it is definitely true that under the UPA, the states were the location of policy dynamism much more than New Delhi was. I think here what he's essentially showing, not in that statement and in this, in the other 10 points as well, is that I'm here, I'm Prime Minister, and I'm anti-UPA. All that you need to think about is I understand where they went wrong, and I am not going to repeat their mistakes.
And in other words, the real reassurance here is that the nightmare, in quotations, that you've lived through under UPA is over. A new world, a new dawn has started.
Exactly.
All right, that's probably is the best explanation for what otherwise might seem to some as if they were just well-intentioned cliches. My thanks to you for coming to studio. My thanks also to my other two guests. My apologies that we had such a terrible time with R.G. Jared and that particular line. I'm afraid in this age of technology, sometimes technology itself lets you down. There we end this particular show. Goodbye. Good night.